Hello, and welcome to video 2 in the Van City Business Climate Series on measuring your emissions. I'm Jill Doucette, Executive Director of the Synergy Foundation. Before we begin, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are presenting today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw people. Just to recap, decarbonization can truly be a business strategy. You can look at reducing your operational costs, tracking your environmental performance and understanding where you can improve. You can use this to strengthen community and government relations and enhance your brand. You can also use decarbonization as a way to align your climate action with the values of your workforce and other stakeholders. This is a really powerful way to tackle climate change while making an operational impact and improving your business overall. Decarbonization is about investing in a low carbon future. And as a business resiliency strategy, you can align your operations with the 2030 goals and be a business for the future. You can use decarbonization as well as an important tactic in attracting those who are values aligned to your business's mission and goals. We know reducing our carbon footprint is important to the planet, and now investors, customers, and employees are paying closer attention. The international standards for carbon accounting include these. We have ISO 14064-1 and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Following these standards ensures that your carbon metrics are as accurate as possible and encompass what your business needs to be responsible for. So let's look at what is a carbon footprint. A carbon footprint measures the sum of all greenhouse gas emissions produced in 1 year as a result of your business operations. The first year you measure your emissions is referred to as your baseline year. A carbon footprint includes 3 scopes. You have emissions from direct sources owned or controlled by the business, emissions from energy purchased by the business, and emissions from indirect sources that you don't directly control or operate. We'll learn more about this in the slides to come. Let's look at how to measure your emissions. For most small and medium-sized businesses, measuring your emissions isn't actually that complicated. It's all about following a key series of steps. First, you want to identify your emission sources, set your emissions boundary, categorize your emissions into scopes 1, 2, and 3, and gather your activity data that will give you your total carbon footprint by converting that data into CO2 equivalent. Let's start with identifying those key emission sources. You may recall these sources from video 1. Consider your key operations and what sources of emissions you may have. Do you have combustion engines? Do you burn fossil fuels for building heating or cooking? Do you have a large bank of refrigeration units? Do any of your business processes produce emissions as part of your manufacturing or as part of the decomposition process? Start with your core operations, the very known emission sources, and work your way up. Once you have a list of emission sources, you need to determine which sources your business is responsible for. This is referred to as your boundary. There are a few ways you can consider your emissions boundary. Most footprints are based on the control approach, meaning that all emission sources you have control over, for example, buildings you own or operate, vehicles you lease or own, those are within your boundary. This generally follows the logic of if you have control over the operations and you have the ability to make decisions about it, you have control over those emission sources are within your boundary. You'll also want to establish a geographic boundary. If you have multiple locations, are you measuring the impact of one location or the whole company's operations? The time frame consideration is the simplest. You're generally looking at 1 year, or you may want to align with a calendar year or your fiscal year for the simplicity of reporting and aligning with your financial data. Next, let's break down your emission sources into the 3 scopes that we mentioned. Scope 1 are those direct emission sources combusted on site in your company-owned vehicles or leased vehicles, as well as stationary sources. So this may include natural gas, diesel, propane, and other sources. Scope 2 are emissions combusted off-site to produce the electricity that you consume. Scope 2 is the simplest. Every province has a different emissions factor for electricity. Here in BC, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our electricity are relatively low due to the majority of our energy coming from clean hydropower. Scope 3 is the most complex and involves indirect emissions from all other sources. This includes business travel, emissions from landfill waste you produce, staff commuting, and the shipment of goods. In this scope, you may not have direct control over the emission source, but your business activities contribute to these emissions. You may want to use a chart like this to have a reference for categorizing your emissions. Next is where the real work begins. You want to gather your activity data and convert that to CO2. So what that may look like is gathering data such as a kilowatt of energy usage, or a kilogram of waste, or a liter of diesel, and using an emissions factor to convert that to the tons of carbon equivalent. Here are some important tips for data collection. First, you want to be working with your finance team. This is where most of the data will live. You can start with creating a spreadsheet and gathering all of that activity data throughout the year. Ensure that you record your methodologies, your calculations, and your estimates. Raw data is best if available. Use invoices, reports from providers, such as from your waste haulers, instead of using industry averages. However, you can use industry averages as a backup if you don't have raw data available. You can work with your suppliers as well to provide this information to you on a regular basis. So you may request this as part of their invoicing or as part of their annual reporting. And this is an important one. It needs to be someone's job to do this. So ensure that somebody has this in their job description to be collecting data related to the GHG impact of your business. And finally, improve every year. It's not going to be perfect the first time around, but the purpose is to start to understand this data, start to get a picture of your carbon footprint, and improve as years go on. A few additional best practices as you shape your carbon footprint. You may want to consider a materiality rule. Businesses often have key questions about exclusions. If an emission source is expected to be less than 5% of your total carbon footprint, you may consider this rule. In other words, sources with very low materiality or impact on the total carbon footprint could be excluded due to their insignificance. It's important to disclose which exclusions have been made, but this rule can make it simpler to really focus on your big emission sources. Another best practice is to avoid reducing the scope of your carbon footprint. Ideally, the scope of your emissions only decreases if your business ceases to do a certain activity or it divests from a key asset. For example, selling a building or no longer working from an office. Businesses should continue to add emission sources as data becomes available. And lastly, measuring your carbon footprint should not be a one-time activity. Ideally, you're reporting annually or biannually and making those results public. The act of doing this increases transparency and encourages other businesses to do the same. So getting in a rhythm of reporting GHG emissions is best practice. So you may be wondering, how am I going to do all this? Well, you don't have to do it all from scratch. There are online calculators, software programs, and free tools available for businesses. Here are a few example tools that you can check out and find what's right for your business. There are also some industry-specific tools available, for example, for hotels, construction, and other industries. So you may want to check with your local industry association to see what they have available. So once you have a baseline, your first carbon footprint report, you'll understand where your emissions come from, and you can start to look at potential reductions. Let's take a quick look at this ice cream shop as an example business and look for some opportunities for emission reductions. In this business, their number one emission source is natural gas for building heating. In BC, our electricity grid is relatively low emissions. So for this business, switching to electric heating, such as an air source heat pump, would make a really big difference. And while they plan to make that investment, they can ensure their heating system is optimized and insulated. A heat pump can also provide cooling, which is increasingly important as we see climate change shifting our weather patterns. This business also has 3 vehicles that are all fairly inefficient diesel or gasoline vehicles. So this business could switch to an electric cargo bike for neighborhood deliveries and errands, which would also save big on parking, and look at hybrid or electric replacement for the other vehicles over time. Finally, this business could reduce their landfill waste probably by about 50% just by doing better sorting and asking suppliers to send them less wasteful material to start with. So overall, it looks like this little ice cream shop could reduce its carbon footprint by maybe 50, 70% by 2030 with some good planning and an intentional approach. And that brings us to talking about emission reduction targets. This is a common question. How do I know what target to set? So here's a few things that might help you shape what emission reduction target you decide to set for your business. You may decide you want to align with science-based targets. Science-based targets are a corporate standard based on scientific consensus on global emission reductions required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On a global scale, this means achieving 50% CO2 emission reductions by 2030 and net zero global emissions by 2050. To align with 1.5 warming scenario, companies must achieve around 4.2% annual GHG reductions every year. You may also consider aligning with Canada or BC targets. Canada's net zero emissions by 2050 goal is on a similar trajectory as science-based targets, with a slightly lower goal by 2030. In addition, you may look at BC's Clean BC Roadmap to 2030, which has goals to reduce emissions and adopt 100% clean energy by 2030. An important thing in setting a target is to look at your major emission sources and say, what can I realistically reduce? What might this cost to my business? And consider short, medium, and long-term goals. You may also ask yourself, how does my business compare to industry averages in my sector? You can reflect on these various government level goals as well and see if any of those make sense for your business to align with. Another key consideration, especially for growing businesses, is absolute versus intensity-based targets. For example, a business may set a goal to reduce emissions by 50% compared to their baseline by 2030, and this goal may mean that they will be below 500 tons per year at that point. For businesses that are rapidly growing, they may also set a goal that states they aim to get their production emissions down by 50% per unit. For example, per pound of coffee roasted or per bicycle manufactured. So there are two ways that you can look at your targets. This really depends on how rapidly your business is growing and how much you can commit to absolute versus intensity-based metrics. You may also consider publishing your target publicly. This is also important for setting industry standards and continuing to push your sector forward. Of course, you also want to be communicating this with your internal team and making this a shared goal. And finally, this is the most important step, is creating an implementation plan, having short, medium, and long-term actions that will support you achieving your target. To get more specific on best practices for targets, you want to publicly report or declare your target, include a baseline year and a target year. For example, we aim to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2028 over our 2011 baseline year. You also want to consider the year in which the target will be met. Ideally, your target looking forward is within the 5 to 10 year timeframe. And of course, you may decide to align with science-based targets, so you can consider some interim metrics such as 4.2% annual reductions to align with that initiative. Thank you for watching video 2 in the Van City Business Climate Series on measuring your emissions. We encourage you to check out video 3 on decarbonization examples and funding the change.